There can be a sense of grieving after brain injury for survivors and for the entire family. And today we are going to dive deeper into the emotional side through a story from a survivor and caregiver, Kelly Lang. There is always hope, and you are not alone.
Hi, I'm Cristabelle Braden, and this is my brain injury podcast, Hope Survives. Here we share information, education, and support for the brain injury community. This is an uplifting podcast to bring hope to your darkest days. As a survivor of traumatic brain injury and multiple concussions, I know what it's like to struggle to find hope. I don't want anyone to feel as alone as I did, and that's why I started my online community called Hope After Head Injury. This podcast is an extension of that, and I'd love to invite you to join along as we explore the realities of life with brain injury, with messages of encouragement, interviews with doctors and professionals, and survivor stories. No matter where you're at on your journey, there is always hope.
With a little hope, you can make it through today. With a little faith, someday you'll get through the pain. Just a little love is enough to light the way through your darkest night. Hope survives. Hope survives.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Hope Survives podcast. So glad that you are listening and here with us today. Today, we have a special guest, Kelly Lang. She is a co-author of a book called The Miracle Child, Traumatic Brain Injury and Me. And she's a brain injury survivor and a caregiver to her daughter who sustained a traumatic brain injury in 2001. So she's going to talk about this from the side of both having an injury herself and caring for a daughter with a pediatric brain injury as they were in a car accident together. So her story is so encouraging, and it is just really, I think you guys are going to get a lot out of it. We actually ended up talking a lot about the emotional side and the grieving process and kind of what that looks like from both aspects of her being a caregiver for her daughter and yet also going through it herself. And so I know you're going to be able to get a lot out of it. Kelly also co-leads the Brain Injury Association of America's Advisory Council, and she serves on the Virginia Brain Injury Advisory Council. And her advocacy experience includes working with the National Center on Advancing Person-Centered Practices and Systems Brain Injury Learning Collaborative. And she's served as a member of the Traumatic Brain Injury Leadership Group and the Person-Centered Advisory Group. She's been the keynote speaker at several state and national brain injury conferences and conducted workshops and webinars, as well as a lot of other things. So I'm really looking forward to sharing this conversation with you all. Thank you guys so much for being here, part of Hope Survives podcast and part of our community. We have been having great Zoom support groups this month. We had our Zoom TBI group, Hope After Head Injury, for the month of November, and it's always different every time, but we actually had a number of new people who hadn't shared before, and I just love getting to hear the stories and just the encouragement and the way that we uplift each other. I mentioned last week's episode that I've been pretty overwhelmed, and that's kind of still the case. I've had a lot going on that's been hard for me to process, just some things that have affected me a lot, as well as I got sick with a cold over the last week. So this episode had to be delayed coming out yet again. And I've decided, you know what? Better late than never. And so I'm glad to finally get it out to you guys. I'm still getting over a cold. And I notice when I'm sick of any kind, with a brain injury, it's like it brings up all my brain injury symptoms as well. So it's kind of hard to function. But yeah, you guys know how it is, right? It's ups and downs, but we don't give up. We know there's hope. So thank you guys so much for listening and being a part of our community. And without further ado, let's get on to today's interview. I'm really looking forward to sharing this one with you all. Today, I am here with Kelly Lang. Welcome to the podcast, Kelly. Thank you so much for coming on and doing this.
Oh, thanks, Cristabelle. I'm so excited to be here with you.
So, Kelly is an amazing advocate for brain injury. I admire you so much and all the work you've done over the years to advocate for TBI as both a survivor and a caregiver, which we will get into here. But you do advocacy work on the national level. I met Kelly in DC for Brain Injury Awareness Day down there. You've been on councils. What are you? You're the, I'm sorry, I'm trying to like read this on here. You co-lead the Brain Injury Association of America's Advisory Council, and you serve on the Virginia Brain Injury Advisory Council, as well as a lot more advocacy work. So first, I just want to thank you for all the work you've done for TBI.
Well, thank you too. That's how I met you, as you said, at Awareness Day, and have followed you and all the advocacy work you've done, and with bringing music into it too. It's just been amazing.
Oh, well, thank you so much. And I believe back in 2017, your daughter was there. I met her there when we were at DC in 2017. So didn't she speak there?
Yes, she was the first panel member that, usually they have a panel and they usually have
Yeah.
one survivor. And she was the first pediatric survivor who spoke at, the Awareness Day event. And that was a huge moment for her and for my husband and I. And the fact that she got a standing ovation was, awesome. I still get chills when I think about it. But it was such a great experience, and how welcomed she was by, government officials, professionals, survivors, caregivers, everybody involved in brain injury. It was a huge moment. And I think that might have been your first year there as well.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I can't remember if my first year was 2016 or 2017. I think my first year might have been 2016, but I don't fully remember. But I know I
Yeah.
was there. My mom and I were there, and I saw on your website, I saw the video of her speaking, and I went back and looked. I was like, oh, I remember that. I needed that little memory jog because I don't always remember things out of the blue, but when I like see something, it's like reminds me. And I remember just relating so much to everything she shared because I had my brain injury in pediatric as well. And so I think it needs to be talked about more. So thank you for the advocacy work both you and your daughter do. So as people are listening, they're probably like, okay, let's get to the story. So can you share a little bit about your brain injury story, and then we'll kind of just go from there?
Sure. So it was 2001. It was in November. It was November 27th. And so, 9/11 had happened. And my husband had been laid off at the beginning of November of that year due to, he traveled a lot for his job, and there was travel restrictions, and the company just had to lay off a bunch of people. And so he was out of town on a part-time consulting job, and I was taking my two daughters, who were 5 and 3 at the time. Olivia was the youngest at 3, to a Nutcracker rehearsal. And the last thing I remember is getting in the car and pulling out of my driveway. And they were listening to, I'll date myself, a Blues Clues CD on the CD player and singing along. And the next thing I remember is total auditory memory, no visual, of my 5-year-old yelling, "Mommy, mommy, wake up." And I heard someone talking to me on my left side saying, "Is anyone else in your car?" And I immediately knew something was wrong with Olivia. And I don't know how I knew that. And I just remember yelling, "Save her." And the next thing I remember is waking up in the emergency room and seeing my 5-year-old sitting in the corner and asking me if we were going to be late for her rehearsal. I had no idea what had happened, although I knew enough that we weren't going to make that rehearsal. But I had given the nurses all the wrong information. We had just moved. we were still in the same town, but a different address. And luckily our home number was the same. But I gave them my husband's former work information. They were frantic to find him. And little did I know he was on his way back on a flight, landing at the exact same time at Dulles Airport. So I had given them my best friend's phone number, and Kristen had just had a baby, maybe 3 weeks prior, and she came to the hospital so she could ride in the cardiac care unit ambulance with Olivia because they wouldn't release me. I didn't know at the time how serious her injuries were. They didn't tell me, and they did not expect her to survive that ride. So I'd asked to see her in the emergency room before they took her. And I remember I went to reach over to touch her and I couldn't move. And that's when I realized that had a C-spine collar and I was on a backboard. Had no recollection of any of that. And then they lifted me so I could touch her. And I said, told her I loved her. And I just said to them, please take care of her. And the EMTs later told me there was not a dry eye in that entire hallway. He said even the ER doctor was in tears because no one thought she was going to survive it, but she did. She survived the ride. She survived the brain injury. I'll make the story really brief. She was in the hospital for 2 weeks, and then we were transferred to an inpatient rehabilitation in Baltimore, and she was home by December 28th. So we were in the hospital total of a month, which was huge because we were told she'd be in rehab for 6 to 9 months. And she just made amazing progress while we were there, enough that she could go home because we felt that if we got her home, things would be better. And then my injury wasn't diagnosed till about 2 months later. I just didn't feel right. I knew something was wrong. You know how we get those feelings like my sleep was off, I couldn't read. And so I went to the doctor, and I always remind people this was back in 2002. A lot of people didn't talk about brain injury. And so I was really lucky that the nurse practitioner recognized my symptoms and immediately referred me to a neuropsychologist. And it's interesting because I look back on it going, how did I not realize what she was doing? Because I knew what a neuropsychologist was. I knew what they did. I had met with them when Olivia was in the hospital, but I never realized she was looking for brain injury on me. And sure enough, that was the diagnosis.
Wow.
So I was in shock.
I'm really surprised that you got your diagnosis that quickly too. That's such a blessing.
It really, it was. I mean, because I've heard stories, I'm sure you have, of survivors who go years and years, some decades, before they get a diagnosis. But I think this nurse practitioner just knew something in her must have said, this woman needs an evaluation. And like I said, when I got that diagnosis, I was devastated. But then I thought about it and said, you know what? Maybe it's a blessing because I might understand a tiny bit of what Olivia's going through. And that way we can do it together. I didn't need to relearn how to walk, talk, and eat and play. But, the fatigue and some of the organizational things and memory issues, the word finding, especially in the beginning, was really difficult. And so I could understand when she got frustrated. I could understand she didn't need people to give her the words. She needed to come up with it on her own. And I could sort of understand it. Obviously I'll never be in her shoes. I wish could trade places with her any day, but I have a little bit of more of an understanding than maybe someone else.
Yeah. So what was your recovery process like? The journey of both having a brain injury and caring for a child with a brain injury?
Well, as most mothers would say, you always put your child first, which is exactly what I did. And I don't know if that was right or wrong, but that's what I did. And so her recovery definitely became paramount. I didn't actually talk a lot about mine. I went to cognitive behavior therapy, but it was kind of on the cusp of becoming a thing. And it really wasn't helpful because I don't think they really knew what they were doing. And I went, I had physical therapy because I had neck pain, and I also ended up with two carpal tunnel surgeries. So I had physical therapy, but that was it. Um, I felt if I could get her to a certain spot, then I might be able to focus on me. And what I ended up doing is I waited till she was in school full time, until she was 6, before I went to grief counseling at that point because it was recommended that you know, I needed to kind of grieve what had happened and what I had lost, and then to get over that, and that was helpful. I mean, it people look at you like, why do you have to go to grief counseling? The person's still here, but there is a huge loss of I lost like what our future was going to look like. I lost what my future was going to look like, and I needed to resolve that in my own mind and heal myself. And so that was huge part of my healing. Um,
How
and
did you get
trying to
referred to grief counseling, or did you think of that, or did somebody recommend it to you?
Someone recommended it, and I can't even tell you who that was, to be quite honest. But I ended up with someone. It's interesting because I don't think I would have chosen her necessarily, but she was the perfect person for me at that point in time. I really, I'm grateful I did it, and I highly recommend it for people. I I think I knew I had to somehow overcome all these feelings. I was trying to do a lot. I was trying to take care of my family, making sure that my older daughter was okay. I didn't know how much it was affecting her. I knew it was affecting her, but I just, I wanted to make sure she was good. I wanted to make sure Libby was okay. I wanted to make, my husband then ended up finding a job finally and making sure he was okay. He had a lot of guilt for not being there. So I was taking care of everyone else and kind of put myself to the wayside for a while, and then decided I needed to. And yoga was another huge thing for me. That really helped me to learn how to breathe, which sounds really funny, but to breathe correctly and how to take that time for myself. And I would feel so much better walking out of that yoga studio. And I think those are, and taking the time for me and understanding. And, I got involved with the hospital there was a trauma survivors group, and I started speaking with them. The first time I spoke was our 1 year anniversary, which I thought
Wow.
was ironic and also healing in a way, that I got to
Yeah.
tell our story to EMTs who were doing a refresher course, that this is why you need to do the work you do, because you save these people and you heal these families. And
Yeah. Thank you for sharing. Wow,
sure,
just that's amazing. So I have a couple questions or
yeah.
thoughts. Number one, is that when you spoke there, is that how you started getting into realizing that you could share your story or do advocacy work?
Yeah, I had I'd seen something in a newsletter that they had this group, and I contacted them, and I thought, that's something I could share my story. I mean, I knew I could do that. And so I went, and they had me watch a couple times, and it was interesting because the first one I went to watch, I had a flashback to that scene in the emergency room where I was saying goodbye to her. I had not remembered that scene until that moment. And I
Wow.
was like, wow, that was really powerful. So I started talking and sharing my story. And then I met um, someone, Anne McDonald, who was soon going to be the executive director of the Braden
I love Anne.
Association.
She's so
Yeah.
kind.
I met her at a conference about a year or two into it. And I don't know what it was. She was an occupational therapist. She was talking about, therapy with brain injury, and it was all focused on pediatrics. And I don't know, there was something about her, and I went up to her afterwards and asked some questions and introduced myself. And we started this relationship. I would reach out to her if I had a question. She always knew the answer. And if a slight chance she didn't, she would find out for me. And we built this relationship. And then I was on her board. I mean, it just started to go, like certain things started happening. And so I think that's really, she taught me a lot of how to advocate and how to use my story. I don't have to tell all the nuts and bolts of it, but to use parts of my story to make a difference. And um, that's really how it all started too. And I should
That's
mention
great.
that
And
in between there, I had another baby. So
wow.
I had yeah, in 2008, I had another baby. So that also added some stuff to it.
Yeah. Well, that to everyone listening, just hearing Kelly share, realize that your story has power. Your story is valuable. And I love how you said, you don't have to share all the little nuts and bolts even to make a difference. So many people feel like they get bogged down. And like, I know I get overwhelmed because it's like my brain injury happened 16 years ago. There's no possible way I can share 16 years. It can feel overwhelming, but being able to just like the general parts. But I want to go back to your combination of grief counseling and yoga. I think that's incredible because so many survivors, you get into going to your rehab therapies and occupational and vestibular, and the grief side really is not addressed, and that's part of the whole person. That's part of this holistic approach of like there could be lingering symptoms because you are in this state of grief, or you are in this state of not being able to, you haven't worked through unprocessed trauma, and that can contribute. And then with the yoga, when you said breathing, that immediately set off in my brain how deep breathing has now been shown scientifically to rehab the autonomic nervous system, and that deep breathing is actually one of the techniques that is used now to for autonomic nervous system recovery and controlled deep breathing. And so you didn't even know you were doing therapy for your autonomic nervous system. You just knew you felt better when you did it. And so just seeing like these pieces of these things that you were able to do without even knowing maybe necessarily that you were doing them.
Yeah, I mean the yoga. I remember the person who told me about the yoga was she was someone who I had known before our accident, who actually was in the Nutcracker. Her daughter was in the Nutcracker also, and we were sitting in a ballet studio talking, and she goes, "You know, you might really like yoga." And I was like, "Really?" Because I was more like I was a runner, and I'd like to do more hard cardio. And she goes, "Yeah, you should try it. You should go this. I know this, yoga instructor. You should try it." She's not. She goes, "It's not what you think." And I was like, "Okay, I'll try it." And I thought, why not? And there was an immediate connection with yoga. Immediate, like some people have to, say they don't really like it, or they have to go a number of times before they get it. I don't know what it was, but it was. She was spot on. I got it, and it helped me so much. And that grief, it's so interesting. I've been having those conversations a lot recently that grief, they say there's the stages of grief, and they don't necessarily go in one order, and they never don't necessarily end. People think like, oh, I've grieved for a year, I'm done. Yeah. I mean, even just last year, it all came back to me. Like I was at a conference, something was said, nothing, and when it wasn't even something innocuous, it was just some comment, and it was like, whoosh, here comes the grief again.
Mm.
And it took me a little bit to get, I've also learned not to push it down and not feel it, because it's just going to come popping up at the wrong time. But to actually sit with it and say, you know what, this really stinks. This is really sad. And I have to feel these feelings, and then I can move on. And you can be sad and happy at the same time. That's something I don't think our society actually teaches us, that you you know you can be at events, and you can, one way you're sad, but another way you're happy. Like, I'm sad when I hear Olivia tell her story, because it is sad, but I'm also happy and proud that she's able to stand up there and tell her story. So I can be both things at the same time. And I think that's really important for people to remember, that
Yeah.
it will come back. It doesn't completely disappear, unfortunately. I wish it did.
Yeah. I love what you said about sitting with it, because I think I think at least for me, after my brain injury, I spent so much time trying to have self control over my emotional responses and my symptoms, because I would have these episodes where I would lash out, or I would blow up, or I would just sob, or I would get angry. I had my brain injury as a teenager. So I lost door privileges because I slammed the door too many times and my parents took the door off the hinges. They're like, you lost your door privileges, and it's like, but I had all this anger inside of me that I had no way to express. And so with my TBI and the frontal lobe injury, I would just have these unhinged, impulsive emotional responses. And I spent so long trying to learn how to not blow up on my sister or blow up on my mom. And, hopefully not friends. My family got the brunt of it though. And so I spent so long like doing like brain injury rehab and trying to work through the cognitive side of that what went unaddressed was the actual emotional side, that I started to not trust my feelings, because I would think that if I'm feeling this certain thing, it's probably just my brain injury making me feel like I'm angry, or making me feel like I'm sad. And so I didn't trust myself. And over the years, that had come out in different ways. And I ended up in some other situations that were traumatic. And I had a lot of unprocessed trauma. So my neuropsychologist actually sent me to a trauma therapist because he said, I can't help you, Cristabelle. Like, we've done all the brain injury techniques that we could do. Like, how to recognize your symptoms, how to help your brain injury. He's like, the stuff that's coming up in our sessions, it's trauma. You need a trauma therapist. And so he actually said, you need to find a different therapist. And I went and found a trauma, a private practice that specializes in trauma. And she wasn't necessarily trained in TBI, but that's who I've been seeing the last 4 years. I've been at that practice, and it has helped me. Is it been 3 or 4? But that has helped me more than anything, because I had to learn how to trust myself and trust my emotions and sit with them instead of pushing them away, which is what we're trained to do in OT.
Yeah, I mean, you're completely right. And I mean, Olivia went through the same thing where I would say she would go from 0 to 60 in like 2 seconds. And, you know, and it's interesting that even, I learned so much about my own self through being, through watching her and such. And I've always been very emotional, but I had noticed that I was extremely, like the littlest thing would just set me into tears. And it wasn't until another survivor mentioned to me that they are very quick to emotion since their brain injury. And I went, huh, maybe that's sometimes why I do that. Like I had never connected it. And it's, and it is a release if I let myself cry, because then I get it out and then I can move on. And so I have learned through trial and error to deal with it. And you're right. Trauma therapists are supposed to be really great. It doesn't matter if it's brain injury or any other type of trauma, of helping clients, deal with those deep rooted feelings that I think society has taught us, bury, only bring out the happy thoughts and try to bury all that negativity. And I call it the toxic positivity. It's hard. And I'm grateful that you're getting that, that assistance and that help, because I think it's so pivotal.
Yeah. What encouragement would you have to survivors listening that might have all this unresolved grief or trauma or complex emotions about their injury or the process of recovery? What encouragement would you have for someone who's going through that?
I would say they need to try different modules of therapy, doing regular yoga. There's also yoga therapeutic, yoga for trauma. It's hard to find, but I know there are some who do it. Supposedly that helps you to release a lot of those feelings. A trauma therapist is huge. And, I know a lot of people don't have health insurance, and it's really hard to find, practitioners who will help you, but you can ask if they'll take, do a sliding scale or pay as you can go. For a long time, I would only take Olivia to someone who had brain injury experience, which is really, really hard to find in some ways. It's easier now, but way back when it was really hard. So see if they have they don't have to necessarily be certified in brain injury, but see if they have some experience of working with people with brain injury. And sometimes you even have to say concussion because, again, still people don't understand concussion and brain injury are one and the same. It's just a
Yeah.
different level. Um,
Yeah, my
and
therapist didn't have experience too much in TBI, but she researched it and was willing to learn more about it, which I think was good that she's like, okay, like to help you, I need to learn more about TBI. And I was able to help educate her as well, because I was at a stage in my recovery where I could explain my TBI symptoms. But yeah, I think you're right. It would help to have somebody who has some experience in brain injury, just in general.
Or, you just mentioned that you had helped when we first had our first speech therapist for Olivia, she didn't have brain injury background, but her mother did. And so she would consult with her mother who lived in Texas on certain things. And she did her research, like you said. So a lot of therapists are willing to do that because it's a learning for them too. I mean, they want to help. That is their job. That's why they got into the field. So I think it's really important to, say what brought you there. There's some still who pretend like they know what they're talking about when really don't. But you can you can pick those out. And if a therapist, I'm a big believer that if a therapist is not working or doesn't feel right, find a different one because you have to make sure you have a good fit.
Yeah, that's so good. So I want to shift gears a little bit here. Through your years of recovery and your daughters, as well as all your time in advocacy, what are some of the main difficulties that you see brain injury survivors face or that you have faced and you've found that you have in common with others?
Well, the number one is the invisibility for a lot of people that people don't realize that there's a disability. I mean, I wrote an article that was she looks fine because working through the school system from the time Libby was 3 up until, well, still working with the community college system, going to doctor's offices. And that was the one that actually kind of surprised me is we'd go to doctor's offices and the first thing they'd say is, you look great. I'm like, you're a neurologist. You should know that it's not really what's on the outside. It's really what's going on the inside. Um, so that is one of my frustrations is people just think that because you can walk and talk, you're fine. And I really wish, I think it's getting better, but I really wish it would keep, I think we still have to keep pushing that needle and keep talking about that. Um, I think it's been hard for a lot of survivors to feel welcomed into the professional, what I call the professional brain injury world. I think our experiences are really valued. One professional had said to me one time, you know, all you caregivers and survivors sitting in the audience at these conferences, you actually have, a PhD level education because you've lived it every single day. And, you have to share that experience because it's so valuable. So, and I think I see that happening more and more that it is being valued. Um, I think it's hard for us to figure out where we fit. I mean, that's been my biggest challenge is where do we fit in the scheme of things? Where do we fit? We do have very unique experiences.
Where do you fit? Can you elaborate? Where do you fit, like in the world, in life, in the brain injury world,
In the brain
or in
injury world
all?
or in all. Well, for some, it's in all.
Yeah.
I think in the brain injury world, where do we best go? I mean, you know, there's some who don't want to work in brain injury, and that's fine. But they have to find their way, and finding a place that is going to accept them with their accommodations, or know that there's going to be a day where you are more fatigued than you will be tomorrow or the day before, or you need, multi-step directions, or you need more time to process, a question or direction. So I think knowing that it's okay to ask for those things, I think that's number one. I think it's actually easier for me to ask for Olivia than it is for myself. So I've been trying to teach myself that I have to show by example. Um, and that's also how I started talking more about my own injury, is because I realized that in order for her to feel comfortable, I needed to talk about me and show her that it's okay, that this is not something you should be ashamed of. It's not anything you did, it's something that happened to you, and you're doing the best you can. And that's all that is expected, is to just to try to do your best. And not every day is going to be at 100%, and that's okay.
Hmm. Yeah, you said a lot there. Thank you. I love how you pointed out that every day is not the same. And that's where I think so many of us get tripped up because, we'll have a good day, quote unquote good, with lower symptoms. And maybe it'll be a day that we're working and our employer sees that and like, oh, we're doing really well. But then there's no guarantee tomorrow is going to look like today did. And it's like we have this inconsistency. At least I've noticed inconsistency in my energy and in my fatigue. And everything just seems to affect me more. Like if I don't drink enough water or if I don't have enough protein or if I don't get enough sleep, I can't just shake it off like my sister. Like my little sister, she actually did have a concussion, a soccer concussion in middle school, but she actually recovered from that. She still has a couple lasting effects, some things in her vision, and things like that. But overall, she recovered like a lot of people with concussion do. She can stay up late. Like she will always want to hang out with me and stay up late talking. I'm like, I cannot do that. She could stay up late and bounce back and be fine. And I do not have the capacity to have a late night. And it's just things like that that I think people just don't understand, that every little thing affects us. And then it's
Mhm.
really easy to get hard on yourself. Do you find that where like the ups and downs are just like it's hard to deal with those?
It is. I mean, you're right. You don't know from one day to the next how you're going to feel, and then if you're more fatigued, it's harder to accept, you know, things that don't go well. It's harder to, if someone says something to you, and it could be like the most simple remark, but you might take it differently. And that upsets, and that gets you out in this cycle. And you just have to, yes, it's taken me a long time to accept it for myself, that I'm going to have these days where it's okay for me to sit back and not engage as much, and not, and try, it's my, try to have those recovery days in there. And it took me a really long time to do that for myself. I mean, at first I was always trying to go, go, go. And I quickly realized that was not going to work for me. Like something was going to have to give. Um, and I tried to explain that to Olivia, that, you need to work in those days that I call them her nothing days. Doesn't mean that she doesn't have to do nothing, but those are the days that she doesn't have to be somewhere. If she's feeling good, that's great. But those are the days where she can kind of sit back and say, it's a rest day.
Yeah, building
And
in
I try
rest
to,
and recovery.
yeah, because I don't feel, for a lot of us, that the recovery never ends. I mean, it's an ongoing, lifelong recovery, and we have lingering symptoms that continue. Yes, sometimes they get better, but I can't say that they're all going to go away. I mean, everyone's different. And you can,
Hmm.
even the doctors will say, you see one brain injury, you see one brain injury, that
Yeah.
they can't predict how you're going to do. They can base it on other patients, but they'll even say no one's the same,
Yeah.
which
So you wrote a
that's
book.
frustrating.
Yeah, it is frustrating. Sorry, I wanted to ask you about your book. So you wrote a
Yeah.
book called The Miracle Child about your story with your daughter. You also do keynote speaking and advocacy efforts. So how do you manage all of those things with your own symptoms and injury? And what encouragement do you have to survivors who are trying to balance stuff?
Um, so how do I manage it? The book, was a very long, it'll be 23 years in November. So the book was a long process, and it was basically came about because when I would speak, at these, especially at these EMT refresher courses and also at some of the local universities to students, a lot of people would say, "Oh, your story is so unique. You should write a book." And I had started a journal when we were in the hospital, only to refresh my own memory. I probably was catching on there was something going on, but I didn't realize it. And so I would write notes like when the doctors came in, the nurses came in. And it was also a journal for my husband and I because we switched on and off at the hospital. So if we didn't have time to tell each other everything, we would write it in this notebook, and I kept it. And I would use other notebooks all through the years. Um, and so we decided maybe we should write a book. But it was, you know, there were a lot of starts and stops, especially on his part. And he would be the first to admit that. Um, so finally in 2020, when the pandemic occurred, we had the shutdown. I said, wow, we have all this time now. And we're kind of stuck here. So why don't we decide what we're going to do with this? And so we did, and that's how it came about. So it's written in a diary format, his perspective, my perspective, because we both came at it at a very different angle. We were both parents of the same child, but, I think his male brain and my female brain came at it very differently. And we continue to parent that way. But I think it helped. We weren't always helicoptering over Olivia. Sometimes we were having to let her go and make her own decisions and make her mistakes. So, and I hope it provides inspiration to other families because that's what I looked for when we were in this situation and I could never find it. That's how so managing the writing I did on my own time. So the days that I felt really fresh and great and the days I didn't, maybe I would review some stuff or maybe I just didn't do anything. The
Sounds like you
keynoting,
gave yourself grace and you gave
I
yourself
did give
the
myself
ability to
grace.
make it a process. And you
Yeah.
were, it sounds like you just allowed yourself to um, have that margin, which so many of us push ourselves so hard that we burn out, me included. And so,
Well, we weren't working on a deadline, so that kind of helped. Like we were working on our own deadline. So when things happened,
yeah.
we could put it aside. Um, the keynoting happened after, like when the book was being published. I started to apply to a couple state conferences. Maine was my first one, and you know, figuring out again that was a different scenario. Like figuring how you write your proposal, and and I had other friends who actually helped me to figure out how should I, craft this story because I didn't want to, be the clinical version of, well, first we did this and then we did that. I mean, that wasn't the point. So my first one was all about communication because I felt like communication was difficult throughout the whole process with doctors, with nurses, with educators, with family, friends. So, I talked about that. And then I started to like just do different stuff. Like I did one, I keynoted in Virginia where I talked about how the entire family is affected, not just the person with the brain injury, because I do feel that we all were affected in different ways. Even my youngest daughter, who wasn't born, she's affected by it, which, to me, that's mind boggling because she wasn't even here. But yet she feels that trauma. She sees the day to day of it. And in some ways, has made her more empathetic. But it's also, it causes some sibling issues, of course. There's always sibling issues no matter what. But so I think I'm able to kind of pace myself. I think that's the biggest key is I can say when that burst of energy comes, I have to use it. And then I need to step back sometimes.
Mm. That's so encouraging. Thank you for sharing that. And that just inspires me too, because, it's people will ask me, like, how do you do all these different things? And it's like, I do not do them at the same time. I
Right.
can't. There's no possible way. You see it on writing, and like I read your bio, it's like you've done this and this and this and this. And it's like, but I'm hearing you talk, and it's like you give yourself grace and space. And that's, I hope our listeners know if you want to start sharing your story, if you want to write a book, if you want to start advocating or speaking, give yourself grace and space to prepare. don't put yourself on a deadline. Like, let yourself have the ability to work at your pace. And that goes for everything in life, right? We have to go at our own pace because our healing journey is a process. And it's not just like this linear up, like it takes setbacks and ups and downs. So thank you for sharing that. As we're wrapping up here, I always ask our guests, what are your words of hope for our listeners? And for you, could you speak to caregivers and could you also speak to survivors?
I love the fact that your hope survives, because hope was always was the key word for me. It still is. Um, and because I always had that hope that things were going to get better, that things were going to work out okay, or things were not going to be as dire as they first seemed. Um, and so my advice to others, caregivers and survivors, or both, is to tell your story. You don't have to tell your entire story. You can tell just a little piece of it to get, what your meaning is. Um, and everyone has a story, and everyone's story is valuable and teaches at least one other person something, gives them some little nugget to take away. And to surround yourself with a community that is going to support you. Brain injury is hard, it's a lifelong, but you also have to find the little joys in life, because without those little joys, where would we be? So if that is, you know, having a pet who you can, sit with and you can snuggle with, having, a warm cup of tea, or going out to a garden and smelling the roses, whatever that little piece of joy, going to yoga class, is, do that for yourself, because you need that and you deserve it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's so encouraging. Thank you for that hope. Can you speak something directly to caregivers?
Yes. So, for caregivers, I would say you have to take time for yourself. When they tell you on an airplane, you should put the oxygen mask on yourself before you put it on your child. And we all kind of like laugh at that, because how, would we actually put it on ourselves first? But you have to, because if you're suffering and you are exhausted, you cannot take care of your loved one the way that they need to be taken care of. And I talk about that a lot, especially I've been working with a lot of trauma organizations, and speaking up for the caregiver, that if the caregiver is not taken care of, the patient is, or the loved one is not going to heal as well, because they need a healthy, strong caregiver in order to get the best. So you need to give yourself grace. You need to give yourself space. You need to give yourself rest. Enlist other people to step in to help you, whether that means making a meal or picking up groceries. When people ask, what can I do? Tell them what they can do. Maybe even, I've heard this, that make a list ahead of time. These are some areas that people might be able to help. So when you're overwhelmed and someone says, what can I do? Instead of saying nothing, say, here's a list. Can you do one of these things? You know, any little bit of help will take that little piece of load off of you for even just a couple minutes. It is helpful. So you have to take care of yourself.
Thank you so much for sharing, Kelly. This has been such a beautiful conversation. I know our
Yes.
listeners are feeling, you just have this, I don't know, calmness you kind of radiate, and just this like, it just peace, and it just makes me, it makes me feel like just, I feel like accepted with my injury through talking to you. And I hope that our listeners feel that you can give yourself grace, that you can give yourself room to grieve, that recovery is a process, and that you don't have to push yourself so hard, observe your symptoms and, adjust as necessary, right? So thank you so much, Kelly. Is there anything else you'd like to say as we close?
No, thank you for the opportunity, Cristabelle. And yes, you are very much accepted. And, I appreciate your comments about the calm. I'll have to have my children listen to that. Just a small section. See, I am calm. Actually, I think they think that. But it's been just a great conversation. And, anything to help others, I'm all about that, which I think you are too.
Yeah.
So I feel that
Thank you
connection with
so
you.
much. Yes. I'm so glad we finally got to do this.
Yes.
So Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for tuning in to Hope Survives podcast. Make sure to subscribe and stay tuned, and would love for you to consider leaving us a rating or a review. Check out hopeafterheadinjury.com for more. I'll see you next time, and remember, there's always hope.